Hi, my name is Ian Schreiber. I'm a game designer. I also teach game design, and this talk is similar to a lecture I give my students at some point during most classes I run because it's not covered anywhere else in the curriculum. I start by showing this curve and asking, has anyone seen it before? Obviously, it's a math function of some kind, but most people don't recognize it by sight. But it's important, not just in games, but in life. So at some point in the semester, just about everyone feels just low-key awful, like they suck at making games, maybe the admissions department made a mistake letting them in this program, all their classmates are amazing, they're the only one who doesn't cut it, and what they don't realize is that everyone else in the class feels that way too. That graph I just showed you is the reason why, but before we get into that, I'm going to tell you a story. Our story starts with this guy. Here he is on camera robbing a bank. He walked in, held up the teller, smiled and waved to the camera on the way out. Wasn't even wearing a mask. Later that day, he was surprised when the cops showed up at his home, but his real surprise came at his criminal trial, where the prosecution showed this video. He couldn't believe it. He was heard to say over and over again, "But I don't understand, I wore the juice." To explain this, criminal genius heard that you could make invisible ink using lemon juice, which is true. Brush lemon juice on paper, wait for it to dry, it'll look like normal paper, only revealing its message if you move it near a heat source, but he thought that invisible ink worked the way it did in cartoons, that it actually made him invisible, and that meant he wouldn't show up on security cameras. Oops. So most people just laugh at this story, but these two people, David Dunning and Justin Kruger, had a different thought. They wondered why. Like, sure, okay, this guy wasn't exactly the sharpest knife in the drawer, but surely he must have known he wasn't that bright. Maybe it might have occurred to him to ask a friend who was smarter than him about his cunning plan before he put it on the line, but he didn't. Why? So they designed some experiments and showed that this phenomenon of thinking you're smarter or more talented than you really are isn't just reserved for bank robbers. There's a little bit of juice wearer in all of us. For example, if you ask a bunch of people, are you above average at driving? Not expert, just above the median, about 70% say yes, which means at least 20% of those people are wrong. And it gets worse. People who are wrong tend to be wrong at the extremes. Terrible drivers think they're great, but some expert drivers think that they're not. This is true for most things. Most surgeons think they're above average at surgery. Most programmers think they're better at programming. Everyone thinks they're a great game designer, except the great game designers who think they suck at game design. So this graph, it's called the Dunning-Kruger Curve, and now that I've labeled it axes. On the x-axis is how good you are at a particular task, and on the y-axis is how good you think you are. The dotted line is where you would be if your self-assessment was always accurate. The solid line is how people actually judge themselves. We're usually way off on the whole judge yourself thing. So here's why. The skills you use to perform a task are actually the same skills it takes to accurately judge how good someone is at that task. If you're an expert at something, you can tell a master's work from a novice's. But if you're just starting out, you'll miss the nuance in a masterwork and might not tell the difference. If you can't judge other people's skill, you won't do great at judging your own. So why novices tend to overestimate their skill instead of underestimate? Mostly because self-serving bias. We're protagonists in our own story. We're the good guys, the heroes. If we're going to err in judgment, we're going to err on the side of guessing that we're awesome. It's one of those tricks our minds play to make life bearable. Now in the second phase, something happens. You're starting to get a little bit good, and so now you can see the flaws in your own work. You've got enough mastery to realize there's all these new things to master that you haven't even started at because you couldn't see them before. And so this feeling never goes away. It always follows that feeling of mastery, which is why masters in a field feel stupid and insignificant. And so we tend to overshoot. This area below the curve on the right half of the graph, it has a name that you might have heard of. It's the feeling that everyone seems to treat you like an expert, but you know you're actually a fraud. And it's only a matter of time before someone else notices, and then your only response will be, "You're right, I was wondering when someone would figure out that I'm an imposter." So here we are, with an entire room of students, with everyone looking at everyone else and feeling like they are the only inferior one. The programmers are in awe of the designers who can make fun games. The designers are impressed by the artists who can weave visual magic. The artists think the programmers are just the side of sorcerers. Everyone thinks everyone else in the room is an expert, and they're the only one who isn't. All of them. So what's really happening here is there's an entire classroom filled with people who are just good enough in their core skill set to be convinced that they suck. I'll also point out that this isn't just a single curve. Each of us is somewhere on this curve for each skill we have. So keep in mind that you're probably not as great as you think you are, but you're probably not quite as bad as you think you are either. So most people feel this at some point. The worst are the creative fields. Every artist, writer, and game designer that I know has these feelings from time to time. Also, about half the programmers and scientists I know And yes, including me. That's even with me knowing this exists and having tons of conversations with colleagues where I have to convince them that they don't suck as much as they think. So I'll just leave this quote here. If you can't read it in 20 seconds, just pause the video or something. So you might be wondering, okay, well, what do you do now about this? Is there a cure to this disease? Well, I don't know about a cure, but I do have some advice that might take the edge off. The first part is just knowing that it exists, that it's common enough, that it has a name. And now that you know, next time you feel this way, take a step back and realize there's at least a possibility you're being unfair to yourself. Another thing I've found that helps is mentoring, as both mentor and mentee. When you're the mentor, the things you think of as basic will sometimes just blow your mentee's mind, and you'll realize maybe the reason it's basic to you is because you're actually good at what you do. When you're the mentee, you can get a realistic assessment of your competence from someone good enough to have a real opinion. Every now and then, challenge yourself to do something that stretches your skill set a little. Doesn't have to be totally outside your domain, just something that's difficult but achievable. It'll help reinforce your confidence in your abilities, and as a side benefit, it'll widen your skills and you'll actually get better too. Oh, and mentoring also has the side benefit of helping other people too. Last piece of advice is build your social network. Have some friends who can tell you what you need to hear, not what you want to hear. If it helps that you have a person It helps if you have a person that you can send a quick message to, where you can get a sanity check on whether your work is good. None of this advice is perfect, but these are the strategies I've used. So good luck.